Are you awake?
For now.
Welcome to Art Talk. I'm Jillian Saxo. I teach in the Department of Art and Design. Thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure tonight to introduce Ian Factor. Ian was born in Boston, Massachusetts. He studied at the De Cordova Museum School in Lincoln, Massachusetts, the Museum of Fine Arts School, and Mass College of Art in Boston. Earned his BFA from the School of Visual and Performing Arts at Syracuse University in New York. In February 2012, Ian began the full-time MFA program at the New York Academy of Art for Figurative Painting, Drawing, and Sculpture in New York City. And in May 2014, he graduated with a focus on painting and anatomy. He is currently an Oregon resident and is on the faculty of the art department at Western Oregon University in Salem, Oregon. And he's a friend of mine and one Tim Timmerman. We're really glad that he's here. Thanks, Ian. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Jillian and Tim. This is great. Thanks for the honor of being here. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So, let's see how to start. I graduated from Syracuse University with a major in illustration and a focus on painting, figurative painting and sculpture. And then for about 7 years, made a living back and forth between illustration, commercial illustration, trying to get my work into galleries in New York and Boston, and painting murals and doing t-shirt design and waiting tables and working in snowboard shops and things like that. And I did a million things to try to make a living. And then I started focusing in on really just sort of graphic design at that point, and the painting was for my own pleasure. I wasn't really that turned on by the whole gallery scene because of a number of things like politics. You go into a gallery when you're 22 years old and you say, do you want to see my work? Can I show my work here? And they say, let's see your resume. You're going to hang my resume on the wall? I thought I was going to hang my paintings on the wall. So it was sort of like this wake-up call. And moved to Colorado right after graduation and was living in Colorado in Vail. And I was snowboarding, and I was actually riding for Burton snowboards and painting murals in Vail and doing graphic design and all sorts of other stuff. And I started doing graphic design for Burton. And I started doing illustration and snowboard graphics for Burton. And then I hit a tree snowboarding in the backcountry and almost killed myself. And Burton hired me full-time, so they flew me back to Vermont. And I started working at Burton full-time as an in-house designer and illustrator for Burton. I did that for a few years and got completely burned out on the graphic design world because my background was painting and drawing and sculpture. And so bounced around Boston, and then at the age of 25, I guess 24, 25, left Vermont, moved to Boston, and got my first actual full-time teaching gig at Montserrat College of Art, just outside of Boston. So I was 25 and I started teaching. And it was kind of a trick because I was teaching students who were my age and older than me, but I had already had much experience in the field, and especially working for a company like Burton. It was kind of an intense opportunity. Did that for a number of years, and then when I turned about 27, 28, I was doing all sorts of stuff. I was designing, I was illustrating, I was working in-house in Timberland, I was designing for Timberland, I was teaching, I was painting my own work, trying to get that in galleries. So I was doing everything I could to survive. And I realized at a certain age, 27, 28, that I wasn't happy. I was making a lot of money, but I wasn't really happy because I wasn't making my own work. So I decided I was going to leave all of it, and at 28 started saving up, and 29 I moved to Italy and traveled backpack for about 6 months all around Italy and Spain and painted and drew, and then took a studio in Florence. Turned 30 in the Alps, which was pretty awesome. Like, if you can ever do that, I highly recommend turning 30 in the Italian Alps. It's great. But we did that, and then moved to Florence, took a studio there in the center in Piazza Signoria, and painted like a maniac full-time for about a year. And it was a life-altering experience. And I did that because I needed to convince myself, I needed to confirm for myself, like, how important is this thing that I've been doing my whole life, this thing called painting? And how important is it for me? But I sort of knew, but how is it important? I mean, does anyone care about this stuff? Like, is it important to the world? And I tell you, living in Florence, you realize how important it is for the world, and you realize how profoundly moving the work can be. It was the first time in my life I'd ever actually come to tears, physical crying in front of a piece of artwork. It happened a few times in Florence and in Rome. It was unbelievable. I mean, like, looking at the David and like falling onto my knees, and just standing there and then falling onto my knees and crying. It was sort of like a weird experience. I never had that happen. So it was life altering. And at that moment, at 30, I decided, okay, I'm not going to do anything else for the rest of my life. I'm just going to paint and sculpt and teach, because those are the things that are most meaningful to me. And it's a difficult path. It's a difficult path, as many of us know. But life can be difficult, and life is difficult. Life can be beautiful. So you might as well focus on the things that give you the most happiness, so you can deal with all the other nonsense. Right? Anyhow, after that I moved to Maine, skipping forward, and I'll go through in the images. I didn't bring any images of stuff I did back in the early days and Berkeley days, and I brought stuff from Florence forward because there's already too many images. But I'm going to tear through these things. I'm going to go really fast. I don't want to get to questions and answers, but I want to go through about 100 images. Right? So it's a lot, maybe a little bit more. I apologize if it's going to fry your brains a little bit, but I'd rather leave you with a lot of stuff in your minds than not enough. So we'll start with, okay, it's here, but not there. Oh, so this is something I want you guys to think about. Those of you who are, raise your hand if you're a visual artist. Okay. So this applies to you guys. Raise your hand if you're not. Okay, so this applies to everybody. It applies to you too. It applies to everybody. But these are things that I didn't think about in my younger years. The idea of technical narrative, has anyone ever heard that? Okay, so technical narrative is something that I discovered in my 30s, and then it was pounded into my brain in my late 30s, and then when I got to grad school, I waited for a long time to go to grad school because I was already teaching, and I was like, why do I want to spend $150,000 on something that I don't need? In my late 30s, I realized that I needed something more in my life, and it wasn't just more travel. It was actually focused education, And I decided to go to the only school in the country that offers that type of training, which is the academy. And then they talked about this, and we talk about this a lot. And technical narrative is basically what I want you guys to start thinking about with your own work. And this has a lot to do with what you and I talked about today about your work. I didn't talk about this because I didn't want to spoil the fun. But so essentially, technical narrative is a concept that if you combine the subject matter that you're dealing with, right, or your idea, your concept, and your technique or your material, your vehicle, and then your emotional response to the subject. So you have your subject, and then you have your emotional response to the subject, and then your technique and your material supports your emotional response to the subject. And so it's not just this random, I'm trying to make this thing not be terrible, because that's mostly like when you're learning how to paint, you're like, just don't make it terrible, like let's do the best I can, like not make it awful. But eventually you get past that and you can make it not terrible, but then what's the next step? The next step is to connect these three things, and there are very few artists in the history of art who have done this, I think, successfully. Goya is one. Eric Fischl, is another contemporary guy. Rubens, another great one to look at. So there are a few, but there are there. And so think about this as we're going through, because this is what I've been trying to get at. Like, this is what I've been trying to solidify and clarify in my own work in like the last 10 years. So technical narrative, this should be, people's sort of idea of where you want to head with your work eventually, and ask questions later about this. Okay, so this is, when I was living in Florence, I did this big painting of the Vatican stairwell. This is acrylic. And at the time, I was working in a tiny little studio, and I had to paint with acrylic because I was making giant paintings in a teeny studio, and I had these things to dry really quickly. So I was working with, this is about 5 by 6 feet or something. It was big for me at the time. So this is sort of the beginning. This is when I was about 29, I was doing this work. And then I started doing paintings of churches and facades of beautiful things. I saw a big acrylic, very loose and drippy. These are not great reproductions, but there we have it. And then I'm going to fly through these. I was doing portraits of people I knew in Florence. This was the dean of the Syracuse University program, who happened to be in Florence when I was there, and I did a portrait of him. This is a young woman who I met in Florence. This was in my studio. These are all acrylics. This is another painting. These are all from life in my studio. This is bigger than life size. This is about 4 by 6 feet or something like that, a bit bigger than life size. Same woman, great model, one of my good friends. This is also looking out the window of the studio towards the Palazzo Vecchio. This is another painting. So these are all acrylics. These were things that I had done early on, and I was really looking at a lot of Sargent, John Singer Sargent. I was looking at a lot of Freud, Lucian Freud. I was looking at a lot of Botticelli. I was looking at obviously all the Italian masters. Then I started loosening it up a little bit. I started painting with gigantic house painting brushes, and I had a giant gutter that I bought at a local shop, a house gutter, and I would just throw the water on the wall and pouring all over the place. I had buckets of water. It was a really fun experience. But still, the technical narrative wasn't connecting. My technique was one thing, the subject matter was another, and my response to the thing was something else. So I was not even aware of technical narrative.